Gentlemen, this is a tale of betrayal and deceit. Anyone who engages in infidelity should bear in mind that their dishonesty will eventually be exposed, and they will have to face the consequences of their actions. I married at 23, and my wife was 21. We crossed paths in college during my junior year, and our connection was immediate and undeniable. From the very beginning, it felt as though we were destined to be together, so we decided to tie the knot after she graduated. I found a job near my hometown, the place where I grew up. My parents ran a farm there, employing 8 full-time workers and 45 seasonal laborers. Both my brother and I worked on the farm throughout our childhoods. For the sake of clarity, let's call my brother Troy. Troy, who was 3 years younger than me, chose not to attend college and instead worked as a laborer on the farm for many years. Even though our father tried to give him managerial responsibilities, Troy preferred the simple life of a farm worker, doing his tasks diligently and receiving his paycheck. That was the life he embraced until he tragically passed away from cancer earlier this year. The farm spans nearly 700 acres and includes 3 homes. My parents live in the main house, set back from the road, which also serves as the office for the farm. My brother lived in a quaint carriage house situated at the intersection of the driveway and the main road. Meanwhile, my wife, kids, and I resided in a farmhouse about 3/4 of a mile away from my parents and brother. To expand the farm and safeguard the farmhouse, my parents bought the adjacent property through the Family Farm Corporation. Consequently, all 3 houses are now owned by the corporation, and my brother and I enjoyed living there rent-free, which was a significant advantage. While my parents held officer positions within the company, they structured things so that my brother and I would inherit the farm when they passed. Under this arrangement, Troy would receive 45%, and I would inherit 55% due to my active involvement in managing the farm in addition to my regular job. Even though I wasn't paid extra for this work, I was given controlling interest. My family and I enjoyed the benefit of living on the property without paying rent, with the understanding that I would eventually become the majority owner. This arrangement fostered a wonderful family environment, and we all treasured our time there. As for my children, my oldest is a 21-year-old daughter, followed by a 20-year-old son. We also have a 17-year-old son, and our youngest is a 15-year-old daughter. Life was truly fantastic for all of us. My marriage to Vera was full of happiness and love. Our children were amazing, my job was flourishing, and the family farm was thriving. With this context, you can better understand the overall picture. Now, let me share the story that led me to write this post. About 3 years ago, my brother received the devastating news that he had been diagnosed with cancer. Unfortunately, Troy had always struggled to put his health first and only sought medical help when his symptoms became unbearable. By the time his cancer was discovered, it had already spread to various parts of his body, marking the beginning of a difficult and painful journey. He endured intense chemotherapy and radiation treatments, which took a major toll on his overall health. Despite everything, he kept pushing forward, still managing to fulfill his work obligations. Earlier this year, we faced the heartbreaking loss of Troy, and it was an incredibly emotional time for our whole family, especially for me. Troy looked up to me as his role model, and I was always there to help him navigate life's challenges. One of the biggest battles I supported him through was his fight against alcoholism, which he overcame successfully 4 years before his death. He also had some serious tax issues that needed to be addressed. I played an instrumental role in helping him sort through these difficulties, as he often struggled with even the most basic tasks life threw his way. Because of this, our bond grew incredibly strong, and we became very close. My wife and children also had a deep affection for Troy, even though they playfully referred to him as Crazy Uncle Troy. It's important to mention that Troy wasn't unintelligent or lazy. He simply lacked the drive and ambition to improve his life and his situation. Over the years, Troy had several relationships, but none of them lasted. Many of these relationships started with women he met at bars, often leading to short-lived romances. There was, however, one occasion when he dated a genuinely kind woman, and I had real hope for their future. Unfortunately, his drinking habits eventually drove her to walk away from him. My parents accepted Troy wholeheartedly, loving him unconditionally, just as they did me. In his will, Troy had named me as the executor of his estate, which meant I was responsible for managing the distribution of his assets. His estate included things like a life insurance policy, a modest checking account, and personal belongings, such as his motorcycle and truck. 2 weeks after his funeral, I found myself at his home, sorting through financial matters and going through the mountain of paperwork he had left on his kitchen table. While going through it, I stumbled upon a statement from a bank located outside our town. To my surprise, the account had an impressive balance of over $70,000. But what truly took me aback were the names listed on the statement. The account was in Troy's name, but my youngest son, whom I'll refer to as Sammy, was listed as the beneficiary, with the acronym POD written next to his name, which stands for Payable on Death. As I went over the details, I felt a wave of confusion. Why had my brother set up the account this way? Why was Sammy the sole beneficiary when Troy hadn't seemed to have a particularly close bond with him compared to my other children? In fact, Troy had always seemed to have a stronger connection with my other kids than with Sammy. I couldn't make sense of it, and no explanation seemed to fit. Initially, I thought about sharing this discovery with my wife and parents, but I decided to keep it to myself for the time being. The following day, I went to the bank, using my position as the executor to gather more information. There, I learned that Troy had opened the money market account just a month after Sammy was born and had consistently contributed to it every 2 weeks. As I pieced this information together, I couldn't ignore the clear link between Troy and Sammy, a connection that left me deeply unsettled and troubled. I found myself obsessing over the possibility that there might have been an affair between Troy and Vera, and that Sammy could be Troy's son. These thoughts consumed me, leaving me anxious and on edge. That night, still tormented by these thoughts, I returned to Troy's house, determined to find anything that might provide answers. Hours passed as I combed through every file and document in the house. Finally, I found something that would change everything. Flipping over a piece of paper, I discovered 2 old photos of my wife. One showed her topless, and the other showed her naked, holding a beer. To my shock, both photos were taken in Troy's bedroom. Devastated, angry, and confused, I stayed at Troy's house for several more hours, torn between crying in despair and boiling with rage. Eventually, Vera called to ask where I was, prompting me to return home. I decided not to confront her just yet. I needed time to process everything and figure out my next move. For a moment, I even considered trying to ignore what I had discovered, but I quickly discarded that idea. How could I possibly ignore something like this? The photos were from years ago, and my brother was gone. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer, so I chose to tell my parents what I had found. The next day, I took some time off in the afternoon and met them at the farm office. I told them about the bank account and showed them the pictures of Vera. It was important to present all the evidence. My parents were absolutely stunned, unable to believe what they were seeing. They were even more shocked than I was. They asked me what my plans were. I told them I was going to confront Vera and, if the allegations were true, I'd begin divorce proceedings. While they understood my decision, my mother advised me to give Vera a chance to explain herself and to carefully consider my next steps before moving forward. After dinner, I went with Vera to Troy's house, telling her I needed her help to clean and organize. Once inside, I guided her to a seat and gently explained that we needed to have a serious conversation. I handed her a packet containing the bank statement and the pictures. I gave her the bank statement first. She looked at it, surprised by the amount of money Troy had saved. I asked her if she noticed anything unusual, but she only mentioned how impressive the balance was. I then asked her to read the statement aloud, starting from the top. She read the bank's name and address, followed by Troy's name. As she continued, her voice trailed off as she read the words, "Payable on death to Sammy," followed by our last name. She looked at me, her expression one of shock, realizing she had been caught. She was stunned, wondering aloud why Troy had done this. I asked if there was something she needed to confess. At first, she shook her head vigorously, but I pressed her again, asking if she was absolutely certain. Reluctantly, she confirmed her initial response. With a heavy sigh, I took out the photographs and placed them in her trembling hands. The moment she saw them, her body froze, and tears began streaming down her face uncontrollably. She pleaded to explain herself, her voice thick with emotion. I told her to tell me her side of the story. She was so anxious that she rushed to the bathroom, and I could hear her retching from the other side of the door. 15 minutes later, she emerged and admitted to her affair with Troy from 18 years ago. She acknowledged that it was a foolish and selfish decision, explaining that the affair lasted only a few weeks. She claimed that she realized the mistake quickly and ended it. Since then, she assured me, she had kept her distance from Troy and only interacted with him in the presence of other family members. I asked her directly if Sammy was Troy's biological son. She answered confidently, "No, he's definitely yours." I asked how she could be so sure, and she insisted that Sammy was mine, even if not biologically, because I had raised him. Her contradictory statements left me a little confused. I then clarified that this conversation was about her relationship with Troy, not my relationship with Sammy. Despite her tearful pleas for forgiveness, I remained firm, offering no comfort or sympathy. Instead, I stood up and decided it was time to leave. I told her not to return home until she had collected herself and looked presentable. I didn't want our children to see her so distraught. I went home, and she arrived about an hour later. Though she continued to ask for a conversation, I told her firmly that there would be a time for that in the future. That night, we shared the same bed, but when she tried to cuddle with me, I rejected her advances. I turned away and made it clear that I didn't want to share the bed with her. In fact, I had no intention of sleeping in the same room. She silently cried through the night, struggling to fall asleep. The next day, I used my paid time off to meet with my parents at the main house. I told them about Vera's confession, and once again, they were shocked by the news. I confirmed that I intended to proceed with a divorce. When my mother asked if divorce was truly what I wanted, I admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that it wasn't my first choice, but after everything I had learned, I could no longer trust her and had no desire for any physical closeness with her. After meeting with my parents, I returned home and confronted Vera again. I told her that I wanted a divorce. She broke down, completely overwhelmed with emotion. She begged me, insisting that the affair was a long time ago and reaffirmed that Sammy was my son. She pleaded with me, stressing her certainty once more. I told her firmly that Sammy was not the issue here. My love for him remained unchanged, no matter who his biological father was. I made it clear that this betrayal was something between her and me. The timing didn't matter, whether it happened 18 years ago or even centuries ago. The betrayal was just as painful. Later that day, I arranged a meeting with our usual farm-related attorney. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, he suggested I speak with a divorce attorney, who happened to be a close acquaintance. Without wasting any time, I scheduled an appointment with the divorce attorney for that same afternoon to begin the legal process. The attorney reassured me that the farm and the 3 houses, all held within the corporation, would be protected during the settlement, which brought me some relief amid the chaos. Despite the infidelity, he explained that our remaining assets would still be split evenly, thanks to my parents' foresight in organizing the farm as a corporation. They had named themselves as the sole officers, a decision that turned out to be invaluable in minimizing the potential fallout from a situation like this. The attorney also clarified that if any of my children were to go through a divorce and had ownership in the farm, their ex-spouse wouldn't be able to claim any stake in it. He explained that the corporate structure of the farm granted no ownership rights to my wife. However, due to Vera's lack of employment outside the home, I might be required to provide spousal support for at least 5 years, possibly longer. Even in cases of infidelity, spousal support was mandatory, which struck me as surprising. He pointed out that the laws heavily favor women in these matters. Although we could consider challenging the attorney's assessment in court, his perspective was based on his past experience representing clients in similar situations. According to him, that was the likely outcome. I had expected this, and honestly, money wasn't my primary concern. My main goal was simply to end the marriage. Once I returned home, I told Vera the news, and she completely broke down. She cried and begged for another chance, but I repeatedly refused. I then told her that I would be speaking with the children over the weekend. I explained that I would talk to Sammy one-on-one first, and then gather all the kids together, including Sammy, to let them know. Vera asked if she could be present for those conversations, but I firmly declined. However, I told her she could meet with them afterward if she wanted. On Saturday morning, I approached Sammy and told him there was something important we needed to discuss. We walked to the creek on our farm, where there was a pavilion with picnic benches. In that peaceful setting, I shared the news with him. As I had expected, he was devastated and overwhelmed with worry. In his distress, he asked me if I would still love him if he wasn't my biological son. I reassured him that my love for him would remain unchanged, no matter his biological ties. I told him not to dwell on it, stressing that it wouldn't alter my relationship with him or with any of his siblings. I made it clear that this was an issue between his mother and me, and that he and his siblings were not to blame. I continued to explain that I would be divorcing his mother, and that the reason was solely her affair with Uncle Troy, nothing to do with him or anything he had done. We spent a couple of hours sitting and talking. I let him know that the next step would be to gather his siblings and have a conversation with them. He asked for some time to prepare, and I agreed without hesitation. I reassured him he could take all the time he needed to process everything and feel comfortable with the situation. Back at the house, we tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, though it was clear that Vera's behavior had shifted. The children didn't seem to notice, as we spent most of the afternoon relaxing by the pool. We played cornhole and tossed the frisbee, giving the appearance of a typical summer weekend for our family. But beneath it all, a dark cloud lingered, waiting to be addressed. After dinner, Sammy came to me and said he was ready to talk to his siblings. Unfortunately, they all had plans that evening, so we decided to delay the discussion until the next morning. The following day, we all woke up early, had breakfast together, and went to Sunday services as we usually did, appearing as a united family. When we got back from church, I gathered the kids and told them I needed to speak with them privately on the back patio. My daughter asked if Mom would be there, and I explained that she wouldn't be with us at that moment, but would join them later. This made the kids uneasy right away. With a heavy heart, I shared the news with them, and it was painful to watch their reactions unfold. At first, they seemed disbelieving, then anger took over, and eventually, sadness settled in. I explained my intention to divorce their mother, and I could see the tears well up in their eyes. We had a long conversation going into detail about what had happened, and eventually, they began to understand and accept my decision. My daughter, emotionally overwhelmed, expressed her strong dislike for her mother and her desire to cut ties with her. I reminded all of them that they were young adults and had the freedom to handle the situation however they chose. However, I encouraged them to consider their mother's perspective and not make any hasty decisions based solely on this one event. Instead, I advised them to reflect on the good moments they had shared with her, because she was still their mother and still someone who loved them. Once the kids learned what had been going on, they all seemed to agree that their relationship with their mom had always been good, at least up until this point. But they were understandably shaken, and none of them felt ready to meet with her right away to try to make sense of it. I suggested that we do DNA tests for each of them, just to clear up any doubts. I explained that their mother had confessed to a brief affair with Uncle Troy, but that I was doing this for my own peace of mind. I needed to know for sure, and regardless of the results, whether they were my biological children or not, it wouldn't change my love for them. After all, they were legally my kids, and that bond was not going anywhere. That evening, Vera sat down with them in the dining room, and I could hear bits and pieces of the conversation from the other room. It was an emotional one. In the end, the kids did express that they still loved their mother, but the way they saw her had been forever changed. It seemed like it would be hard for them to ever fully forgive her for what she had done, not just to me but to the whole family. That realization hit Vera hard, even though it was a consequence of her own actions. After that night, she moved into the guest room, where she stayed until our divorce was final, 8 months later. Over those months, she begged me to reconsider, to go to counseling, but my decision was made and I stood by it. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, a developer reached out with an offer to buy our house and the 80 acres of land we owned. The offer was substantial, and after discussing it with my parents, we decided to sell. This meant that my wife, our two youngest children, and I had to move out within 60 days. Vera found a 3-bedroom apartment in town, and though she thought it would be a fresh start, the reality of everything hit her hard. She fell into a deep depression that required medication to manage. During this time, I moved back into my parents' house. For the first time in years, I began to focus on something I had always wanted, building a house of my own. With the opportunity finally presenting itself, I worked with an architect to design a modest log cabin with 3 bedrooms. It was everything I had imagined, and when it was finished, I moved in with my 2 youngest kids. They spend part of the week with their mother, and I try to keep things as stable as I can for them. Vera, however, is still struggling. There are small signs of progress, but the depression lingers. She's asked me if there's any chance of reconciliation, but I've made it clear that I'm not interested in getting back together. Still, I try to be respectful and kind to her, given everything she's going through. It's strange, though. Discovering the affair completely killed whatever feelings I had left for her. Now, I feel more like I owe her something than anything else. Our conversations are minimal and almost always about the kids. I try to keep things simple and avoid any unnecessary interaction. Even though I can't bring myself to forgive her for the betrayal, I still feel some responsibility toward her. After all, she's the mother of my children, and I don't want to turn my back completely. Thankfully, the DNA tests confirmed that all of the children are biologically mine. The relief I felt was overwhelming, and it gave me some peace of mind, knowing that my kids are truly mine. But in a way, it didn't change much. The betrayal, the hurt, the shattered trust, it all still stands, and I still don't know what to make of the situation with Troy. I don't understand why he'd set up that account with Sammy as the beneficiary. Vera insists there was no conversation about paternity, and part of me believes her, but I can't help but wonder why Troy would make such a decision with no clear explanation. Maybe he assumed something, or maybe he wanted Sammy to be his. Despite the confusion, I've come to terms with where I am. I'm at peace with my kids, and I'm grateful for the life I have now. Rebuilding any kind of trust with Vera seems impossible, but I do hope she finds some happiness eventually. I'm not sure why I'm even sharing this. I guess saying it out loud, in some way, helps me make sense of it all. It's given me a bit of relief, and I find myself appreciating the way things have worked out, despite everything. Now, at 51, I'm working as an assistant manager at a large warehouse, while Vera, at 54, has found a new career as a real estate agent in Tampa. She takes care of her 2 college-age kids, and I don't have any children of my own. 10 years ago, we met at a business convention, and from there, we built a life together. We both enjoy traveling, going to the beach, and spending time with family. We've always valued giving back to our community, volunteering at soup kitchens, organizing food drives, and doing good has always been a core part of our lives. Despite everything that's happened, I try to hold on to the good that I've done, and that keeps me grounded. My wife has always been very socially active, often attending events and spending a lot of time with her girlfriends. Our relationship in the bedroom has generally been good, but there were moments when I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, especially when it came to how she interacted with certain men. There was one incident at a real estate event that I can't forget. I witnessed what felt like excessive flirting with a real estate developer, and it bothered me. After the event, I brought it up with her over lunch. She brushed it off, saying most of her interactions were purely professional, and although she eventually apologized, I couldn't quite shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't being completely honest with me. As time passed, her outings with friends became more frequent. They would often stretch into several days, but I never thought much of it at first. Her circle included a mix of women, some married, some not, and she assured me that these were just fun, harmless gatherings. I've always been the kind of person who gives my full trust until proven otherwise, and I extended that trust to my wife without question. But then one evening, something happened that made me question everything. I was at work when my wife called to say she was bringing dinner home. I heard voices in the background and realized she was with other people. One of the women asked if I was coming along on a trip to Miami. I froze. It was completely unexpected. I asked my wife who she was talking to, and she said it was one of her friends talking about the trip. Still confused, I responded, "No, I'll probably be busy with work." When she came home, we had a heated argument. I didn't even know about the trip, and yet, she was already planning to leave. She told me it had been a last-minute decision, and she had meant to tell me, but one of her friends accidentally spilled the beans. She went on to explain that they had visited a bar, and one of her friends had gotten too drunk. Her job as a real estate agent required a lot of socializing, meeting people in different neighborhoods, taking part in community events, and lending a hand to those in need. But, as I had seen before, she also had a tendency to flirt with men, especially when they were in positions of power. Her work paid well, over $120,000 a year, while I made around $40,000. It took her years to get to that point, and I respected her success. But it stung knowing the difference in our incomes. What stung even more was that she spent a lot of money getting ready for this Miami trip, buying new clothes, despite already having a closet full of things. A few days later, she left for Miami. It wasn't far, just a 4.5-hour drive, but it was a trip I hadn't seen coming. She planned to stay for 4 days, and by the second day, something unexpected happened when I came home from work. I was about to relax when there was a knock on the door. A man in a suit stood there with a large manila envelope. He addressed me by name, handed me the envelope, and left without a word. I opened it, and inside was a note with a phone number and the words, "Call me if you want to discuss the photos." I didn't know what to think. The first photo made my stomach drop. It showed my wife sitting on a man's lap, kissing him passionately. The second photo was taken at a pool, and once again it was my wife kissing the same man. The shock hit me like a ton of bricks. I decided to call the number on the note. The man who answered told me he was a private investigator hired by another husband who suspected his wife was being unfaithful. His job had been to gather information about my wife's social life, and these photos were part of his findings. He then mentioned there were more photos, 3 more to be exact. The images showed my wife and the man sharing more intimate moments. The anger, frustration, and heartbreak I felt at that moment were overwhelming. I couldn't stop the tears from flowing. I called my dad and told him what had happened. He listened quietly and then urged me to stay calm, telling me I shouldn't confront her just yet. He advised me not to say anything to her and to take some time to think things through. I promised him I would. With just 1 day left before my wife returned, I decided to consult with a lawyer online. I explained the situation and the evidence I had. Unfortunately, the lawyer told me that in Florida, it didn't matter much because it was a no-fault divorce state. When the lawyer asked how long we had been married, I told him over 10 years. I wasn't sure what the next step would be, but I planned to hire a lawyer in person the next day while trying to keep things as normal as possible at home. When my wife returned from her trip, it threw off the carefully planned course I had set. She had 2 days off, which meant I had to put my plans on hold for a little longer. On the 3rd day, she went back to work, and that was when I made my move. I left the house shortly after she did. While she was at work, I reached out to my father and to Jake, asking for help with the legal fees, and both of them agreed to assist me. I hired a lawyer and instructed them to begin divorce proceedings, citing irreconcilable differences as the reason. After that, I packed up most of my things, and with my father's help, we moved everything into his apartment using his truck. But I didn't officially move in with him yet. I planned to stay there temporarily, only until the divorce papers were formally served to her. 2 weeks passed, and surprisingly, she still hadn't been served. Another week went by, and at last, she was served with the papers while she was at work. That's when my phone started blowing up with messages from her. Questions like, "What's going on?" I was home that day when I received a call from my ex-spouse, the one from Golden Rays. I asked my father to come over because I didn't trust her, and he arrived just 5 minutes before she did. As soon as she stepped inside, she immediately started demanding to know why I filed for divorce and what had led to my decision. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photos, laying them on the table for her to see. I told her, "These are the reasons I'm ending this marriage." Her face went pale. She covered her mouth in shock. Tears began to form in her eyes, and she tried to apologize. But at that moment, I had no interest in hearing her out. I simply told her, "We'll talk in court." As expected, she flooded my phone with calls and texts, trying to convince me to reconsider. She suggested options like marriage counseling before the court hearing. She hired her own lawyer and did everything in her power to challenge the divorce, but my attorney was just as determined. The case ended in my favor. I received $60,000 from the sale of the house, along with $1,900 a month in spousal support for 3 years. When it came to the furniture, we split it up, but I decided to let her have everything. About a month later, I learned from one of her close friends that my ex had cheated on me, even before the events I knew about. This friend had considered telling me at the time, but ultimately decided it wasn't her place. Later, she expressed regret and apologized for not speaking up sooner. I told her that if I had known about the affair, I probably wouldn't have stayed in the marriage for as long as I did. It's been 8 months since the divorce, and during that time, my ex has continued to reach out, texting me almost every week to check on how I'm doing. But I've made a conscious decision not to respond. I kept my phone number, not feeling the need to change it. It's my right. Even when she mentioned in one of her texts that her children were asking about me, it didn't make me want to reply. The pain from everything that happened is still there, but I've been fortunate to have friends who respect my space and don't bring up the past. I've started therapy to help me heal, and while the heartache still lingers, I'm confident that I'll be all right in the end.